Good evening all, and welcome. I'd like to give a huge thank you to all my patrons who help keep the channel ticking along. Today's Patreon star is Ladonna Steele. Thank you for your very kind contribution. If you'd like to find out more about what Patreon is and get loads of exclusive perks, you can find the information in the description. But anyway, without further ado, it's time for you to all get comfortable. Make sure you've got your hiking boots ready, and let the darkness take control. There was always something that I loved about the night time. The way that the cold air hit my skin, numbing my ears and tickling my nose. Golden rays from the headlights of passing cars danced within reflections in the surface of water puddles, turning pools of murky mess into glittering kaleidoscopes, if only for a moment. Looking up to the sky, to be greeted with such a speckled lagoon, a world that came alive through the darkness to watch over me as I explored the world. All of these things were magical. Day after day, the sun presented itself to me as a white rabbit, insisting only that I follow it down the rabbit hole. I seldom resisted the urge, a fact that I would describe at this point to be reckless. You see, during the months that I had been indulging in this magical world of the night, I was only a girl of 14. My hometown is a quiet seaside village, quaintly populated with an electric mix of characters that I would not envision as threatening. I had lived in my neighborhood for the entirety of my life, and with that came a sense of immunity from the darker cracks of this community. The shady meetings in dark alleys with insidious intent. On this wintry afternoon, my head danced within the nebula of stars above me. I didn't think twice before turning from my road to the left in the direction of the nearby forest, which spanned miles into the mountains that rippled the landscape of surrounding towns. For clarity, the exit to my street had two directions. To the right, a road that connected my cul-de-sac to the rest of the town, laden with lights, houses, and the occasional shop. To the left was this secluded forest lane that travelled through the mountains and valleys that surrounded our town. It was a beautiful walk, continuing for miles as it stretched out like a vein. It was speckled with dim streetlights, causing the lane to exist between a strange state of light and dark, where your eyes twitched in a constant attempt to adjust to the bizarre hue. A flimsy wooden gate ran for the mile on the left side of the narrow lane, separating it from countless fields devoted solely to farming. On the right, the lane was sheltered by hedges, which broke occasionally to connect to small roads that led to the town. I can't remember how long I'd been walking this night. I don't know why I had chosen this forest lane, as I usually had better judgment than to stay too far from the sanctuary of houses and shops. The strongest memory of what happened that night is what came next. I must have been about 2 miles into my walk, when a dark figure emerged from a break in the hedges to the right. I had not seen anybody on my trek thus far, and was automatically startled by this sudden appearance in front of me. The silhouette of this figure was small and hooded, standing no more than 20 feet ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, watching as they scoured the length of the lane to each side of them, before noticing me. As soon as the figure caught sight of me, they took a jaunty lurch in my direction. It seemed like a limp initially, although it was inconsistent in which limb was causing such pain. Fluctuating from right to left, I struggled to make out any features of this person, their features hidden in the depths of a thick hood lined with fur. I stepped back cautiously as they approached me. A voice within me screamed to just run, sprint away, and to go home. However, there was something louder within me that recognized that this person could be hurt. Something about them just didn't seem right, and I was torn as to which part of my judgment to commit to. "Emily?" The voice was shrill, desperate and female. The woman stopped in her tracks as she noticed my retreat. I paused hesitantly. Under the approaching streetlight, I could see the brief outlines of the face under the hood. Her features looked gaunt, worn and exhausted. Dark eyes scoured the details of my own face, empty in their depths as they searched for something, the object of which I would only assume was Emily. "I'm sorry," I shouted across the short distance between us. "I'm not Emily." Her brow furrowed as her eyes flickered with something akin to anger for a brief moment. "I can't find my Emily." I hesitated again, finding myself caught between the two voices inside me. "I haven't seen anyone down this path," she sobbed. "How long have you been walking?" "About 2 miles. I haven't seen anyone in that time." "Are you with anyone? They might have seen Emily." The question struck me as odd. I was alone before her, the path being linear enough that she could detect that I was alone. Alarm bells began to screech within my mind. "I don't know where Emily is, but maybe you'd better look in the other direction." "Why should I do that?" It seemed that a small smile danced around the corner of her lips. It happened over a fraction of a second, but it was enough to shake me into slowly stepping away from this woman. My feet crunched under the gravel, the sound reverberating between us. It caught the woman's attention, and she began her own predatory journey towards me. My heart thumped in my chest, filling up my ears with a rhythmic thud. I began to feast upon every detail of her face, aware of the danger before me, and refusing to withdraw my stare for even a second. "I don't know anything about Emily," I yelled, terror now possessing me. "Leave me alone." She didn't respond. The smile that possessed her features was heart-wrenchingly sinister. It was a smirk with no amusement, just a hollow emptiness that reflected in the void of her eyes. No expression, no life, just darkness. As she continued to step towards me, I knew that I had to run. Without pausing for another thought, I turned on my heels, and that's when I saw him. Within an arm's reach of me, a towering man had been approaching me from behind. The same evil glint tarnished her face, but I didn't allow myself another moment to absorb the details. I ran harder and faster than I ever had before. The ferocity of my feet against the hard path sent shockwaves throughout my body, heart hammering in its overbearing desire to survive. I screamed, trying to draw the attention of anyone who could be listening. I didn't know how close they were to me. I didn't want to look. I continued my sprint straight down the path for about a mile, before taking a sharp turn to the left and thundering my way towards the first signs of life. I found refuge in a newsagent's. The small shop was quiet, occupied by an elderly shopkeeper. My arrival startled him, as I threw myself behind the shelter of shelves and began to sob hysterically. The next few hours were a blur to me, and I remember only the wave of relief as he took me into the back room of the shop, comforting me whilst calling the police and my parents. Nothing ever came from the investigation of the police. I spoke to them twice on the matter, but to no avail. My parents swung between states of relief and rage, and I can't say I blame them. I dread to think what would have happened that night, and even now I have nightmares of how close those hands were. All the while, I stepped closer and closer to them. I'm sure that many people have experienced many dangerous and volatile situations. I understand that this experience could have ended so much worse for me. For that, I'd like to say this is more of a cautionary tale from the reflections of a girl who fancied herself a vagabond, but was actually a lamb, striding straight into a pack of wolves. Always be careful, be safe, and never underestimate the danger around you. When I was around 9 years old, I had 2 of my friends stay over to play and hang out. I was just a little girl who lived in a small neighborhood in a small town, but our neighborhood was full of either elderly couples or young couples with new families and kids to play with. The girls I were hanging out with that day lived in my neighborhood as well, and were the same age as me. My neighborhood was looped into a circle with a cul-de-sac at one end of a little street connected to the circle. My friends and I would always walk down the cul-de-sac because there was a little trail that went into the woods, with a little rustic bridge over a small stream. We also had discovered our way from the woods into a whole different cul-de-sac of neighbouring nearby neighbourhoods, so we liked to walk through to the other side. Recently they started construction in the woods, and there were a couple of new clearings full of dirt piles to make way for some new houses there. That day, it was super muddy. It rained the night before, and we all wore rubber rain boots. We started off down the path, stopping at the bridge. I had just gotten a new digital camera, and we were taking our 2007 version of a selfie together on the bridge. We all thought this was super fun, because especially at this age, none of us really had our own cameras or phones, although I had a little flip phone in case of an emergency that my mum had insisted I bring with me on our walk. After the group pictures and blurry pictures of the forest, we kept going down the paths. They weren't really paths so much as deer trails that we'd memorized from being through these woods so many times. Eventually we came to a clearing where they just cleared out to prepare for construction. As we were all climbing the giant piles of dirt and sand, outstretching our arms at the top, pretending we were kings of the world, as we looked around at the view from above, I snapped a few pictures of the woods from my vantage point, and we laughed as the dirt beneath one of our friend's feet gave way, and she slid down the dirt hill on her butt, and we joked that it looked like she had had an accident. We were just easygoing, innocent kids that had fun over the little things. That's what I'm getting at. Eventually we decided to venture back home, and we were walking down one of the little trails. I've always had good intuition. As we were walking, suddenly I felt my stomach flip-flop, and I froze in my path, looking around nervously. It just felt like we were being watched. My friends heard my footfall cease and looked back at me asking, "What's the matter? What are you doing?" I shushed them and gestured at them to stop with my hand. We all froze and looked around, but none of us saw anything, and eventually one of the girls broke the silence. "There's nothing here. Come on, let's go." I couldn't shake the feeling though. Uneasily I followed them and walked ahead of them protectively, since it seemed like only I could sense there was trouble. But then I stopped in my tracks as we rounded a corner. I saw two grown men facing us, head on along the path we were walking. They were each carrying something. I only looked briefly, but it looked as if one of them was either carrying a chainsaw or a normal saw, and the other one had a hammer or small metal bat. One was wearing a black t-shirt, and the other one a blue long sleeve. I told my friends to run, and we turned around, sprinting down the path that we'd just taken, boots splattering the mud on our pants. I looked back, still running, and they were still following us. But it seemed as if they didn't know the woods as well as we did. I said, "Quick, run to the other neighborhood," and we kept going, weaving through the trees and bushes and thorns. It was like a cliché movie scene, as one of my friends fell, and we frantically, scared, helped her get up and kept running. Eventually we could see the trees were thinning as we neared the other cul-de-sac, and we ran through, our feet finally hitting glorious pavement. We didn't stop though. We kept booking it through the neighborhood. Eventually, when we got far enough away, we turned around, looked at the entrance of the woods, and the two men were just standing there. They hadn't entered the neighborhood, likely because it was more public than the woods, but we could see the blue shirt from where we stood. The neighborhood we were in now is about a 10-minute drive from my house on a main road, which is why we liked taking the woods, since there weren't any sidewalks. However, being 9 years old, and fearing that they'd follow us anyway through the woods, we got onto the main road and called my mum. Eventually she collected us. We were all shocked and crying a little, and my mum called the cops. They searched the area, but never found any sign of them. The thing is, there's never anyone in the woods. Maybe they were construction workers, but there wasn't any construction going on with the mud, and it wasn't even nearly ready to go into the building process. They'd only started clearing the woods, and they were also carrying things that could be used as weapons. The only freaky thing that proved they had bad intentions were the fact that they chased us, 3 9-year-old girls, through the woods with weapons, and I'd had that gut feeling. Thank God my mum made me bring my cell phone on our walk. Also, we'd later gone through my camera of the pictures we'd taken, and in the photo with the high vantage point, you could see a black boot, 1 leg, and a blue long-sleeved arm coming from behind a tree, when you zoomed into a spot on the background. No face was visible though, so they'd been watching us for a while that day too. We were lucky to have known the area, but dear 2 men who chased us through the forest? Let's not meet. I live in Finland, and it's pretty much all forest here. When I was a kid, I went for cross-country biking near to our home. There is a roughly 2-kilometer loop of a forest path in the forest. It is rideable, if not a bit difficult at some points. After just riding a few minutes on a narrow forest path, I see a figure walking ahead of me. It looks like a hooded elderly lady, walking really slowly. I can't see her face or anything, just a dark hood covering her. I recall she being very tall, but I was also only 13 years old, so she could have just been normal size. I went behind her, but the path is too narrow to overtake her on any of the sides, and I get this heavy feeling in my chest, telling me not to try it. I can't explain it, but something just felt very off when I got closer to her. I stop my bike, get off, and watch her walk ahead of me. I then think that this is fairly silly, and she must be startled if she turns around and sees me there. So I think to act cool, to turn down and pick up a blueberry. I pick it up, raise my head back to the road ahead of me, and there's nothing. I can see the path ahead for maybe 50 meters, and it's just impossible that she would have just done that distance in 5 seconds. I then tried to reason with myself. She must have jumped off the road, since there are extremely thick bushes and I can't see into them. I felt a bit uneasy, but decided to continue. I ride about 500 more meters, and then there's a cliff, where I can see down the road ahead for another 500 meters. And there she is. I could see her walking there, again really slowly. Again, tall figure covered in a dark hood. I can't see her face, but I can see the hood she's wearing, and she's walking slowly on the road. I really couldn't figure out how she made it there in such a short time, since even I couldn't do the distance in that time without my bike. I'm extremely alarmed at this point, and decide to continue. I drive the hill down to the spot where I saw her before, and there's nothing. At this part of the forest, it's more open and I can see quite far in any direction, yet she's nowhere to be seen, and yet she was there just 30 seconds before. I continue my trip, and finally finish my first loop of the trail, and decide to go another round. After going for a couple of minutes, there she is, at exactly the same spot I saw her the first time, tall, dark and hooded, walking slowly. I got freaked out by this. I rode off the woods as fast as I could in a total panic to my friend's house, which was actually further away from the woods than my own. Until this day, I still have no idea what I saw, and I get the chills remembering her figure. I'd like to begin by describing myself, because it is relevant to the story. I'm 25, male. I'm a 25-year-old male around average height. I've been doing sports 5 to 6 times a week since I graduated high school. Gym, running, CrossFit, squash, swimming, and any team sports my friends decide to play at any given time. My favourite hobbies are mountaineering, hiking, and bouldering. I just recently purchased a new pair of high-altitude mountaineering boots because it's near the end of the summer season and they were on sale. The plan is to wear them in the Alps next summer on a few ascents. I live in a European capital, one that is surrounded by wonderful nature, with many trails and opportunities for hiking. I decided to break into my boots last Saturday, more specifically because it would have been my granddad's birthday, and he also loved hiking before he died. These boots are overkill for the woods, but I needed to try them. I selected a nice route that's around 25 kilometers, and set off at about 9 in the morning. It rained the day before, so I experienced a fair amount of mud, and not so many people, as they are easily scared off by the weather. Since the summer was excruciatingly hot, it was a nice change of temperature, especially between trees and such, where it's a few degrees cooler than in the city. In the not-so-distant past, my dog would have definitely joined me on this hike, but she's turning 14 this year, and she does not enjoy long-distance walks anymore. My girlfriend had to do something for work on short notice, so I knew from the moment I woke up that I would be doing this hike alone. The first half of the hike was perfect. The altitude difference along the trail is minimal, and I barely broke a sweat, and misjudged how many people would be out due to the storm the day before. I met, at most, 6 to 7 people during the first 2 to 3 hours, and most of them were cross-country runners. It's worth mentioning that I wasn't walking quickly. I stopped on many occasions to take pictures or study some animal tracks, as there are deer and wild boar in these woods. Nothing more menacing. Not animals anyway, but I won't get ahead of myself. Between 12 and 1, the path ran into an actual road, one where cars can go. This road is asphalt, but deep in the forest, and can only be used to reach certain landmarks that are also in the forest, so cars seldom go here. My trail required me to take this road for a few hundred meters. As I was walking along the road, I heard a car approach from behind me. It went past me, not too quickly or too slowly. It was an older, green SUV with a fresh registration. You can tell by the license plate. Probably an important detail. Anyway, I thought nothing of it at the time. Then I heard it come back. It drove past me for the second time. Now, very slowly, I could see clearly that two men were sitting in the front seats, wearing baseball caps and sunglasses. Both had stubble/beard game going on as well, and I assumed that they were gamekeepers, even though those cars have a crest on the hood and on both of the front doors. As I hike a fair amount, I know these things. I see them around quite a bit. They would also not be driving a car like this. They have jeeps, which are more suitable for the forest. Still, I felt no discomfort, and again thought nothing of it. Then my trail left the asphalt road, and began sneaking into the woods again. I walked ahead serenely, gazing at trees and whatnot. Then suddenly, had the strange sensation that something, or someone, was behind me. An engine sound was becoming more and more clear as well. At this point on the trail, it was quite narrow. But if, for whatever reason, you want to drive your car on it, you could just about. Now when I turned around, the aforementioned SUV was basically in my face. It was an arm's length away from me, and it stopped, just as I had. I looked at the driver, who was staring back, as I can only assume this because he was wearing sunglasses. I calmly asked him, "What's wrong? Shall I let you go?" in a polite tone, as his window was rolled down. He didn't speak. He slowly started reversing, and soon he disappeared behind a curve. Now I was quite uncomfortable. I also noticed that he was alone in the car, unlike earlier. I listened intently, standing still since I wasn't sure what was going on. At this point I wasn't scared, but there was a faint feeling of unease in the air, and bad thoughts began gathering in the back of my mind. I heard the car and the engine stop behind the curve. I heard a door open and shut, but nothing from that point on. I turned around and began walking towards my destination, at a much faster pace than before. Now I was a bit scared. I didn't understand why he didn't answer, and why he just reversed and left without a word. I wasn't sure what to make of it, and I had no desire to ask him again, or see him again for that matter. I had just walked enough for these unpleasant thoughts to slowly be erased from my mind. As I had been drinking a lot of water, as I usually do, I needed to go, and I saw a perfect spot, a very narrow path off my trail that led quite clearly to a little hunting tower. I don't know what they're called in English. You know, the wooden structures, a couple of meters tall, very simple, where hunters can sit and wait for their prey. Yeah, you get what I mean. I walked over to the tower, put my bag down by the ladder that led up it, and began to urinate. I was also interested in checking Google Maps to see where I was, but since there was no signal, I decided to check my map. I also had a sip of my water. I'd been camping there for a good few minutes before I decided to go back to the trail, where I deviated from in order to take the leak. Right before I arrived back to the main trail, I thought to myself how extremely quiet it was. No wind, no noise of any kind. There was absolutely nothing. This made me realize just a moment later how alone I was, except for the man who was standing 50 meters away from me on the trail, in the direction where I was headed. I only saw this as soon as I stepped back onto the trail, since the small one to the tower was well hidden by trees, and you couldn't see the main trail, as it was running perpendicular to the small one. I looked at him, and was instantly chilled to the very bone. He was dressed in tactical clothing, with a baseball hat on his head. I believe the only reason he was standing still was the moment of surprise when I had appeared from a place that he had not anticipated. At this point, I was fully and utterly alarmed. He was holding a rifle that had a scope on it. Had this happened without the incident with the SUV, I would have probably walked along the trail thinking he's a hunter. However, in light of the strange encounter with the SUV, from which the second man was missing, something in me snapped instantly. In hindsight, it's also probably illegal to hunt in these woods at this time of the year. I figured, in the matter of 2 seconds, that I was going to sprint through the woods until exhaustion, towards and past the tower, as it seemed natural to do at the time. If there was no malicious intent on this man's behalf, or the others, he'll just think I'm an idiot, and forget about me in 2 minutes. If I'm right, it's the best call I've ever made, and for God's sake, he began running towards me. Adrenaline blossoming within me, I began sprinting away. I sprinted past the tower and deep into the bushes, not sparing my legs as I was wearing shorts and a thermal jumper. I crashed through branches, small trees, and slipped on several occasions. I really did sprint until I was exhausted. It must have been several kilometers. I even crossed some smaller trails, but didn't even bother to look either way. My pulse was at 1 billion the whole time. I began checking for a phone signal, but nothing. I was already really angry at myself for not memorizing the license plate, and after a while I began power walking, but still off trail. Straight ahead, in a direction that I knew would sooner or later lead me out of the woods. When my phone got signal, I told the story to several people frantically, but no one took me seriously. They said I was overreacting. You must not have understood the situation. Well, I'll let you decide for yourself if I did or not. Finally, I reached a trail that led directly to a cute little town that borders this rather large forest. It felt like an eternity. But I walked the last kilometer to the main square. I took off my jumper and put it in my bag. At least I looked a little different from far away. I waited for a bus that took me back to a station near my car rather anxiously. After the bus ride, during which I studied each car on the road, I walked back to my car, got in, and drove home. My dog welcomed me like I was back from a 2-year deployment. Dogs are just amazing. She must have felt that something had shaken me up, and I spent the afternoon contemplating my life in the bathtub. The boots destroyed my feet, but they aren't meant to be sprinted in for large periods of time. I called the forest gamekeeper's office, and I inquired about whether they had such cars in their service as the ones I had come across. They do not. The gamekeepers also don't typically work in pairs. 99.9% of the time, they're alone. I told them my story, and they took me a lot more seriously than my friends, but they assured me that the police would not. No one could have been legally hunting in that area during summer. I've been reading the local news, but nothing extraordinary has been reported yet. I really do hope nothing will be reported either. I live in a very small town. Everyone there pretty much knows everyone else, and unless you're visiting somewhere out of town, you can usually get anywhere you want by walking within 15 minutes at most. Because of this, it's also a very safe feeling place. A lot of people I know just leave their doors unlocked. I don't, because I have experience in other less safe locations, and our police report is actually a source of comedy. because of some of the random and small crimes they have to respond to. But we also get a lot of tourists in the summer, and that's when I typically tend to avoid town, because I don't like large crowds. These people are the types who get crazy drunk or high, and just feel like they can do whatever they want, due to the town's reputation as a relaxed place. But they're generally harmless, if not annoying. So one summer night, I was walking along a bike path to my house. This bike path runs right by a large forest that people like to hike through during the day, and I was currently a little ways in alongside it. It was getting close to midnight, more like 11:30, and so all I really had for light at the moment was my phone's flashlight, since my town usually reserves street lights for inside the main areas. It was then that I heard what sounded like a woman screaming off in the woods. Now, of course, this startled me, but a moment to reconsider made me realize just how many things that could have been. Various animals have been described as making similar noises, or maybe some tourists were drunk and partying out by the lake there. However, I still found myself moving a bit further away from the woods as I continued walking. This screaming continued on and off, which freaked me out a bit more, but I was still theorizing on it being an animal. It wasn't until I heard what sounded like the screaming being muffled that I really panicked. It sounded unmistakably like a person putting their hand over someone else's mouth, and I could hear more heavy breathing from that direction. As I continued walking at a faster pace, I dialed the police and told them that they may want to check out the forest, and I explained what I had heard. The guy I talked to agreed and said that I didn't have to stay in the area if I didn't feel safe, but they would maybe need to call me to the situation for questioning if they found anything. Of course, I didn't want to stick around, so I told them as such and hung up. And then I saw a figure out in the darkness ahead, walking towards me. I audibly gasped, which I always used to think was a thing people say in horror stories to spice them up, but this was involuntary. Still not wanting to believe that I was in one of my worst nightmares, I figured that this was just possibly someone else who, like me, was using this path to get home. I figure we'd just pass each other. I'd momentarily have someone else's company and comfort, and we'd head our separate ways. The guy got closer to me, and I realized that he was walking towards me on my side, with no intention of switching over to let me go. And every time I would switch sides, he would do the same. I also realized that regardless of how dark it is, I would have seen him coming on the bike path way before he got close, so he most likely went on the path from the forest. I turned back the way I came and saw another figure behind me, standing still. I started to exit off the path and just make my way back into town from a back street. But as I started to go to the side, the guy finally spoke, and the freakiest thing about it is he sounded perfectly normal and not really creepy at all, in a tone of voice that would be just like most people speaking, not your classic scary story creep. "Why'd you call the cops?" he said to me in a disappointed tone, like how you'd ask a child why they lied to you. I took off running away from the bike path and up a random street that was nowhere near my house. I heard the footsteps of people giving chase and thought that it could have been my own imagination, but I just kept running. And since I'm not really in shape, I knew I'd eventually have to stop and catch my breath, but I could swear there were multiple sets of footsteps behind me, as in more than the two people that I had already seen. Right as I was about to slow down, I heard the sound of a car getting closer, and the red and blue lights associated with the police could be seen coming. The footsteps behind me faded away, and soon disappeared altogether. I walked at a brisk pace the rest of the way home, and that was the end of it. I still don't know what any of that was, but I'm guessing nothing was found, as I was never called down to the station for questioning. I don't really know how the police go about their business, as this was my first instance of ever having to call them, but I'm pretty sure that's why I wouldn't be called. To this day, I have yet to go hiking ever again there, or stay out past 10 p.m. So to the group of people who made it feel that I'll never be safe again, let's not meet. I was with my brother-in-law in the Appalachians. It's usually snowy in December, but that year it was a constant 40 Fahrenheit or so, and too foggy to see very well. We made our way into a dense rainforest area and found what looked like an extremely overgrown, rarely trodden erosion forming a path. This didn't make sense. It was on the back of an inconvenient mountain peak, and not on the way to anywhere, not even another trail, so we followed it. The deciduous canopy lay on the winter ground, but little sunlight broke through anyway, due to the deep fog and mountain shadow. It felt haunted. We descended into a hollow with a small creek at the bottom, and rounded a bend into a dense clump of rhododendron. Inside this rhododendron bush, we started to see weird things, like decaying rope, rusted metal, paracords and supplies. Then the trail ended. Between two oak trees that formed a window through the brush, we could see a rusted body of metal with the face-sized holes of glass on the sides. We made out the shape of a small plane from the scattered pieces. The body was only in 2 pieces, but the wings were unrecognizable. There was a bit of graffiti on the plane, but not as much as you would expect. It had clearly been there a while, but some of the original gear was still in the body. I wrote down the number on the side for reference. When I got home, I googled the plane number and found a result. Accident report March 1977. Western North Carolina. Damaged beyond repair. 1 passenger, 1 fatality, body recovered. Plane unsalvageable. We found this plane in 2016. The wreckage had been left there to rot for 39 years, and some of the gear had still not been stolen. I know it was only one death, but that place has a deeply unsettling aura. I'm not superstitious, nor do I believe in ghosts, but there was something strange about that place, and I won't forget it. I didn't crawl into the plane's body, both out of fear and because I wanted to be respectful to whoever died there. But I did take pictures of it all from the outside, which you can find in the description. I've been going to therapy for about a month now, and in receiving therapy, I've been revisiting past experiences and finally leaving them to rest. One of the memories is from when I was about 8. I was living in a rural area, my house facing a cemetery, and more graves than the inhabitants of the town I lived in. It was a quiet, peaceful place, a place of serene silence. About 9 or 10 blocks from the north side of the cemetery is a secluded creek which leads to a forest area. I had 2 very close friends. Sarah was my age. Daniel was 2 years older than us. Daniel had 2 cousins, one of which was old enough to drive. One slow, hot Saturday afternoon, Danny's cousin suggested we go out, get ice cream, and drive up to the lake. We all got in the pickup truck, Danny and his younger cousin riding in the bed, and Sarah and I in the back seat. We passed into a small store, picking up ice cream bottled water, and fruits. Ice creams in hand, windows rolled down, and classic rock from the radio had us hyped up for a swim. In the excitement, we made a wrong turn and found ourselves at a lesser used path to the creek. The older cousin didn't feel like driving anymore, so we decided to take our things and wade our feet into the creek. We got out, and immediately I began to get this strange feeling. I could feel the hairs stand on end. Slight discomfort was washing over me. We began to walk the path, Danny chasing Sarah under the threat of getting a bug on her, and I shook the feeling off, instead enjoying the crisp air and the sound of running water. After a good 7-minute walk, we reached a large rock, where we settled our things and stepped into the creek. We splashed around, collecting rocks that shone brilliantly under the water, oblivious to the world. I decided to walk up to the rock, because I began to crave watermelon. I sat down and it hit me. The uncomfortable wave washed over me. An intense feeling that I could only describe as vulnerable. It was as if I were completely naked, being stripped of all forms of innocence and safety. I could feel eyes on my back, so I decided to turn around, fear-stricken. At first I couldn't see anything. I couldn't tell why I had felt so paranoid. After looking for a while, I saw something shiny reflect light. It was brief and small, but I thought that maybe it was a littered bottle or a piece of trash. I could hear Dan calling for me to come back down. I rushed my way down and joined the group. I told the older cousin that I spotted something weird, but that I was too scared to go and check it out. He told me to ignore it. It was probably trash. But even with that, I still felt like something was wrong. We climbed back up to the rock, hydrating and eating between chats and giggles. The older cousin had his back to the creek, where he had a clear view of the same area I looked into. I had nearly forgotten all about my feeling when he stopped. His smile was gone, face pale. Placing his bottle down, he immediately got up and began to shout, "Who's there?" We all turned to look, and saw someone shoot out of the weeds. It looked like a man, and he ran with something in his hand. He started saying that the man looked like he was taking pictures of us with one hand. All the blood drained from my head. The fear that I hadn't spotted the man first washing over me. How long had he been there? Had he been following us since we started walking in? We packed up and left, trying to forget the uncomfortable experience. It wasn't until 2 weeks after that where the town was buzzing over to find a dead body in the creek. We weren't friendly with the caretaker of the cemetery, which was the cemetery chosen for the burial of the body after he was identified. He told all of us that the victim was a teenager who was killed and dumped at the creek a week ago, leaving a disfigured, half-bloated, rotting mess. The murderer was a creepy middle-aged man who lived closer to the forested area. His cabin-like house was searched, and they found toys, collected missing children's clippings from newspapers, and hundreds of pictures of families, which focused on the kids and teenagers that hung out there after school. Sometimes I shudder at the thought that it was very possible that it was the very same guy who was at the creek, and that could have been us. I grew up in a house where my backyard was a huge forest in rural Illinois. When I was a kid, I loved being outdoors and would take every possible opportunity to run amok in the woods with my best friend. When we were younger, 11 or 12, we stayed closer to the house in the outskirts and climbed the trees. When we got to 13 to 15, we would venture deep walking and swimming in the rivers, and building little forts. When I was 16, the forest was roped off and closed off to the public, as a company had been illegally dumping mercury into the woods, or lead, one of those two, but that's another story. It was the middle of a hot summer, and I was around 15 at the time. Dusk was approaching, and my friend had to go home for dinner, but I wasn't quite ready to leave. We parted ways, and I climbed up a tree near my favourite spot over the river. Now these woods backed up to a local gun club, so it wasn't uncommon to hear shooting. However, this gun club was contained in its own private property, and the members never ventured out into the forest. I sat in my little tree for a bit and ate the blackberries that I'd picked earlier while watching it get dark, when I suddenly spotted movement out of the corner of my eye. At first I assumed it was a young deer, because it was large, but not huge. But I quickly realized it was a man. He seemed to be in his late 30s or early 40s, and he wore a black t-shirt and camo pants, with creepy wiry facial hair. He was skulking, like he didn't want to be seen. I thought this was odd, but had no intention of making my presence known, since something felt wrong. And being a 15-year-old girl alone in the woods, I knew that I was at a disadvantage. I slowed my breaths down and watched. At first he didn't say anything as he walked around the base of the trees. It was around that time that I realized he had a gun slung over his back. Once he got near a river where my friend and I had been loudly goofing off maybe 10 minutes earlier, he started calling out, "Hey! Anyone here? Help!" while grabbing his rifle. There was no response and no noise. He gave up after a few minutes and began walking downstream. I waited until it was pitch black before sliding out of the tree as quietly as I could, running home and having my parents call the cops. They never found anything, but I could never bring myself to go back. I've been hunting for a few years now, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff. Mutilated rabbits killed by coyotes, among other things. Bobcat screams are also pretty freakish. But one day while walking on my property through the woods, I heard some branches quietly break about 30 yards ahead. Nothing too weird about that. Rabbits and coyotes bump into them all the time. It happened again, but this time a little closer, and to my right side. I unholstered my .45 XDS. I like the compact version because it feels better. Ready to shoot a hungry coyote. The day before, my neighbour told me how a woman in Little Elm got mauled by some pissed off coyotes a few days earlier. So I was ready to shoot. Anyway, I shined my flashlight through the trees and didn't see anything. I kept walking a little faster, and I heard a high scream with low undertones. It didn't sound like nothing I've ever heard before, and I swear it sounded like a bobcat killed Batman. I took off sprinting back to my house a mile or so away. I'm near the woods tree line, and look back to see a hunched shadow 40 yards staring behind me, like a person trying to walk on all fours. It was dark, so it may have been my imagination. I noped the hell out of there and got into my house. I haven't seen it since, and didn't sleep for a few nights. At the time I wasn't hunting. I like to go for nighttime walks to clear my head, but I never go without a gun. Stay safe and be careful, because I don't know what that was. I went hiking with a good buddy of mine in the Carolina Mountains in the middle of winter. We went way off trail, doing a full day's walk from where we'd parked, so by the time we set up camp we were miles away from the nearest human. We pitch our tent and cook ourselves some food, and we're passing the whiskey flask back and forth, enjoying the near pitch black night and the stillness of our little fire. At first, we felt it, that sudden sensation of not being alone. Then after a few seconds, we heard something move in the darkness. We're frozen. We hear it again. But the most terrifying thing is that this time we realize whatever is out there, there's more than one of them. And they're big. My buddy and I lock eyes. We're too afraid to make any noise yet, and come to a silent agreement that scaring these things off is our best chance. He grabs a thick branch from the fire, and I grab one of the rocks we'd placed in a circle around it. I'm so scared that I can barely breathe. But together we yell as loudly as we possibly can and charge into the darkness. And then we saw the eyes. A dozen pair at least staring straight back at us. We had charged a ferocious pack of mountain ponies, who didn't react at all to two crazy men yelling at the top of their lungs in the middle of the night. They just stared at us straight back, totally unimpressed. Goddamn ponies. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. If you'd like your name on the list above, scrolling through the end credits, all that you need to do is sign up on Patreon, and you'll get access to this little perk. But seriously, anyone who contributes on there, I really appreciate it, and it's like super nice of you. So thank you for doing that. It really helps me out. If you enjoyed the video, do not forget to drop a like and leave a comment, as it's something that's really awesome to do as well, and helps me out loads too. If you're new here, subscribe and press the bell icon to be updated every time I post with new nightly spooks. If there's a story that you would like to share, feel free to post it to my Reddit or send it over to my email. Either are fine. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.